Welcome to Let the Stories Live On by Discover Books, where we discover the stories behind the story through author interviews and book reviews and anything having to do with books. Don't forget to subscribe now and like our page. Thank you for joining us as we get the story behind the story of these two great books on Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln Raw, which covers Lincoln's life up until his presidency, and The Turn, which covers his presidency and especially focuses on a special bond between President Lincoln and his valet. Both these stories dive deep into the mentality of Abraham Lincoln. They are historical fiction, but written on and based on years of research by Larry Fowler, the author, D.L Fowler. Please join us tonight as we dive deep into the story behind the story. Okay, I think we're ready. Hi, Larry. Welcome to Discovering the Story Behind the Story. And tonight we're going to get to know you a little bit better. Your pen name's D.L Fowler, and you wrote two books, The Turn, A Bond That Shaped History, and Lincoln Raw. You can hold up the book because I don't have it behind me in an accidental, I don't know where I put it. And these are two wonderful books on Abraham Lincoln. And I'm going to have you start off a little bit with telling a little bit of your background, because you didn't start off as an author, and a little bit why you started writing these books.
Well, thank you. I'm really grateful that you have me on the show tonight, or the meeting tonight. So anyway, we'll start with my background is kind of interesting, I guess. I find it interesting. I started out shortly out of college. We had a thing called the draft, and and this was back during the Vietnam era. I know I don't look like I'm the 75 years old that I am, but that's, I can't do anything about that. Um, the But anyway, so I to avoid the draft, I joined the Air Force, like a lot of draft dodgers did back in those days, and I was fortunate to get chosen to go to the language school, Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, to be trained as a linguist. And so that was cool because I've always had this fascination with words and how you use words to evoke emotions and trigger people into doing something and so forth. And so just to learn a new language and to learn the nuances of that language, compare that to the English language, that was just fascinating to me. Unfortunately, I didn't stick with that. Didn't get to. I mean, the demand for Bulgarian linguists went away real quickly, uh, and so I wound up doing what I thought I would enjoy, which I didn't. I spent 25 years as a CPA and later as an investment manager, and one of my partners told me, he said, the only time we ever see you smile is when you close the door to the conference room and you sit in there and you work on your computer.
Oh, that's
and
funny.
and I said, yeah, that's because I really don't enjoy what I'm doing unless I'm sitting there with a spreadsheet, and playing with it. As time went on, I had a health scare. When I was in my 50s, I think it was, or maybe even later. And I said, this is for the birds. If I have a finite amount of time on this earth, it's about time I started enjoying the time I have. And the only thing I've ever really enjoyed, other than computer Excel spreadsheets, has been writing, has been language. So that's when I became a writer. That was about 15 years ago.
Wow.
Uh,
So from
and
numbers to
so,
words,
yeah,
that's
so that,
great.
that that's kind of my personal story. Yes, right. Yeah. Well, there is rhythm to both of them.
There is.
And speaking of rhythm, I got a big shock in my system because I've always considered myself a novelist. I've played around with poetry mostly to kind of, hone my language skills. And then because you have to create images with very, very few words in a poem, very stark images. And so I played around with that, and I got involved in a local group where we get up and we do open mics, And I'd always introduce myself by saying, well, I'm not a poet, I'm a novelist. So you have to excuse what I'm about ready to read to you. Um, that being said, it was just a few weeks ago that I won second place in a major poetry contest,
Wow.
and here a regional one at least. And so now, being an award-winning poet, I can no longer say I'm not a poet.
That is fascinating. See, now to me, I love poetry. I started reading Shakespeare when I was in seventh or eighth grade because I had an English teacher who had a daughter my age and we were not friends. And that English teacher would judge me really harshly. And so every paper I had to write, I had to pick Shakespeare to write on, knowing it was above her head too. And she couldn't really judge me as hard. But over time, I ended up learning to love the language of it. But I had a friend, I homeschooled for years, and I had a friend who was uh, a CPA also, certified public accountant, loved numbers, loved math, and she was a mathematician. She just loved it. And we got into poetry, wanting to teach our children poetry. And she found this book, and she kind of ruined poetry for me, but it was The Mathematics of Poetry and how poetry is all based on mathematical equations. I'm like, you just ruined it all. But I learned that it's completely true. There is a rhythm to it, and there is this numeric thing, just like music is based on numbers
Yes,
and it
right.
all correlates. And the more you can conquer that, the more beautiful it is. So it kind of goes hand in hand that you would go from spreadsheets and bookkeeping type things and CPA to poetry of all things. So congratulations on winning the award. Was that local
Thank you.
or was that?
Yes, that was the I was the Lakewold Gardens in Lakewood, Washington, does an annual poetry contest, or they pick 10 poets, and then of course they rank them. And they our poets our poetry is then put on display in the garden at different locations.
Wow.
And not only is it on display, but there's a QR code on each display that you can click, and on your smartphone you can hear the poet reading their poetry.
Oh, how beautiful. That is
Yeah, but
incredible. What a great
so I
opportunity.
my garden poetry, my garden poem won second place.
Congratulations. And also you've won awards. I I know for the turn. And do you want to
Yes.
talk a little bit about the awards you won? And then we're going to talk a little bit about these two stories.
Okay, well, the one that I was got most excited about was the first place award that I got in historical fiction at the with the Pacific Northwest Writers Association. That's an international contest. There's thousands of entries in 12 different categories, but to be picked as first place in historical fiction for me with the turn was, I mean, it brought me to tears actually.
That is
And that happened during COVID, and it was on a Zoom. It was attending the conference on Zoom that I saw my name come up and
wow.
be announced as the winner.
That is cool. That would be a little bit of a different experience than hearing it live and in person with people. Um, and I want to talk a little bit about your books. And there's a connection here for me. Abraham Lincoln, for me, I grew up in close to Springfield, Illinois, in a small town called Lincoln, Illinois. And so I met you several years ago on a whole different, more of accounting type basis. And we started talking about your books. And their first one, Lincoln Raw, I read through it, loved it. And I thought there's nothing more I can personally learn about Abraham Lincoln because I grew up 20 minutes. Every field trip we ever had in school was an Abraham Lincoln site, whether New Salem or Springfield. And I was amazed at how your writing, and I know you've talked about, and I'm going to have you talk about it a little bit. Each word is very precise to you and it means something. You choose it very carefully. And yet you get into the mind of Abraham Lincoln and make the reader see and experience what Lincoln's experiencing rather than telling us. I mean, you're showing us, but from a different perspective. A lot of times authors show
but it's from a third party view or it's from a different, you're actually in the mind. I'm like viewing the events through Lincoln's eyes. And I'm fascinated by that concept. And you said it to me the other day because I said I'm not done reading the book yet. I wanted to have this done before President's Day, and we didn't quite make that deadline. But because you've done it in a way that you can't speed read this, and you said it, and it's true because I am experiencing everything Abraham Lincoln is experiencing in these stories. So I want you to talk a little bit about that and your fascination, first off, with Abraham Lincoln. I know you've written other books, you've written books on how to write books and different things like that, but these two seem to be your passion point outside of poetry now. I'm going to have to include that in there. So talk to me a little bit about what inspired you to write about Lincoln and how you developed his point of view and how you took that on.
Well, to start with, my fascination with Lincoln probably goes back to most people's experience, which is we learn about him in school, and he's there's something that's just magical, like almost about Abraham Lincoln, so that has always been with me. And then I read somewhere that he had suffered from depression. And I said, stop a minute. How is it that a person who has deals with who is crippled by depression can be the man that Lincoln was? And I think that identified with that because I was suffering from depression at that time. And I learned a lot in writing Lincoln Raw about how to manage depression because that is the story of his life. He managed depression, became one of the most monumental, one of the most consequential people in all of history. Um, and so then I discovered, gosh, there's like 20,000 books written on Abraham Lincoln. How do you distinguish yourself?
Yeah.
And it dawned on me after reading quite a few of those that no one ever asked Lincoln about how he saw the world that these 20,000 volumes write about. And I thought that was very unfair that Lincoln never got to tell his side of the story. So I decided, I'm going to do it. I'm going to try it and do it. And it took me 10 years.
Wow.
But I read everything. I reread things and read new things. And in each thing that I read, my question was, how does this fit into Lincoln's personality? How would a person who started out, he didn't even begin talking until he was almost 5 years old. He was a very quiet kid. His people that knew him at that age thought that he was melancholy even as a baby. And so I said, well, this has to be something that it wasn't a learned behavior of his. It was just him. So I said, this is a filter through which he saw things. So how would a person with that filter see the world around him in the events that unfolded around Lincoln during his life? And then, of course, as Lincoln, grew and matured, other factors came into play that became filters for him. And so I just studied those. I studied those things to understand, well, who is this person before I start writing about the events around him. The other thing that I did, and this gets to my style in general, is that I do pick each word carefully. Every word we know of in the English language can have several different meanings, so you look for the right word that means the right thing that you're trying, the right emotion, or is the right trigger for the right emotion that you're working towards. It has to do with the textures that you describe in the setting, or the sounds, or the scents. It has to do with all of that, but it also you have to present it in such a way that the reader is an active participant in those experiences. In a different book that I wrote, it's a more of a thriller action type movie, a novel. I have something I use as an example, which is this character is sitting there. He's lost his wife. He was a billionaire who lost his company, and he got fired by the board of directors. And he's sitting there in this home that he built to be their dream home, their retirement home kind of a thing, but she's gone. And there's a picture of her sitting over on the table next to him as he's sipping away on some beverage, whatever he was drinking at the time. And rather than describing the picture sitting next to him, I said something to the effect of, this woman is staring at him.
Wow.
And he stares back at her, adorned by a silver frame. So it's kind of like that's what is happening inside the character, that they aren't looking at something is looking back at them.
Mm-hmm.
I try to avoid words like look, by the way, because I don't think they have any. I think look, see, smell, taste, none of those words belong in a story.
Right.
If you're trying to trying to take the readers directly into the experience. I think my favorite way to describe this goes back to my editor told me about a film one time that was basically the story of a biopic on Beethoven. And so Beethoven walks into this room where a world class pianist and virtuoso violinist are playing a new sonata that he's written, and he walks in and he says to Schindler, who's sitting there, he said, "How are they doing?" Obviously, because Beethoven has no idea. He can't hear what's going on.
Yeah.
And so he says, Schindler, and then he doesn't even wait for an answer. He says, "Oh, I'm sure they're making a hash of it." He said, "What is music anyway?" To Schindler. He said, "What is music anyway?" And they have this little conversation back and forth. And Beethoven leans forward and he says, "Music is the power to take one directly into the mental state of the composer."
Wow.
And I sat back there and I said, writing is the power to take one directly into the mindset of the character.
And you've done that beautifully, by the way. Go ahead. Keep going.
And so I've spent an enormous amount of energy and study on how to do that. That's my focus when I'm writing.
And I was amazed because, especially in the turn, because it's been a couple years since I've read Lincoln Raw, but the turn, first off, I learned some things about his presidency I didn't know, but we read history so often as children even, and it's so cold and it's so factual. It's so non-emotional sometimes. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, this happened. Memorize some dates, do this, do that. And this book took you into the moments. And I always knew and I heard about and learned a lot about when Lincoln's son, Willie, died. And, it was during the Civil War and all these things were happening at the same time. But you go into that moment. And I found tears coming to my eyes, like feeling for him, like he's got the weight of the world on him. His son is dying. His wife is in hysterics. And he's trying to figure out, and I would describe, he had melancholy, but I would say he was a deep empath. Like he felt things deeply and he felt other people's concerns and issues deeply. He took it all upon himself. And you do a beautiful job of painting that picture of Lincoln as a man trying to cope beyond just his presidency, but with his own family and his own failings. And I just had tears when he's in the tomb. I can't remember what it's really called, but he's in and he's going to visit Willie's tomb and he's just bawling and sobbing. And then he's looking at one point outside the cottage that they're staying in and seeing all the grave sites of soldiers that are dying at what he believes is his hand. And just that deep emotion. And you put us in that moment without being overwhelming, but just this whole new empathy. And it created it not just for Lincoln, but it's this moment. I always read books to try to glean something for myself, right? I try to take something away and to stop for a moment when we're talking about any leader, any person we're dealing with, and realizing we all have these emotional things we're going through on a daily basis, and stopping to try to see their point of view and what they're going through and how difficult it must be to see that. And that's what I kept feeling is, man, Larry just got this so right. I had this empathy for Lincoln that I've never had before, and seeing things come through, and all the facts of the Civil War are there. They're in there, but they're not so overwhelming, powerful that that's your focus. Your focus is on Lincoln as a man and his relationships, his relationship with his children, his relationship with his wife, his relationship with his cabinet and his friends, and then also these African Americans that are in his life, and how he's changing and he's opening and he's doing his best in the time period he's set in, and with the facts and the details he has at that moment. And you can feel at moments his frustration that he can't make things happen faster and he can't please everybody, and he's wanting that. But I just think you did a beautiful, beautiful job of taking us into these very tender moments. And you don't really think about that all the time in historical fiction, that you're going to have these moments where you're absolutely just going to cry and you're going to feel it without, I didn't leave feeling overwhelmed or negative or, emotional afterwards, but I just felt the wave of what was going on and how that influenced his next decisions and how it was turning him and changing him, and just this deep empathy for what it would have been like to be a president in that day. First off, go ahead. Do you have anything to add to that real quick?
I was going to say that one of the things I did discover in all of my research is that I think you hit it right on the nail right on the head when you talked about he was a deep empath. That was the source of his melancholy.
Yeah.
And that's why you can trace it all the way back to his childhood, maybe even his infancy.
Yes. And it's actually his gift, because
yeah,
empaths have to go and hide for a while. They can put themselves out there so long, and then they have to go and process and protect themselves for a little bit. And you can see that throughout his life of where he's doing those things. And I believe it made him a deep, deep thinker and desired to do the right thing or the best thing he could do. Because like you say in the book, he says several times, I can only do the best I can do at the moment. He wants to do the right thing, but sometimes all you can do is the best thing, the next best thing. And I think you just do a beautiful job of bringing Lincoln that person. And I think for anybody that suffered from depression, melancholy, and even impasse really could get into the story and feel it. But anybody in general is going to feel those emotions because you've done such a great job of bringing him to life. I want you to talk a little bit
if
about.
I can say something.
Go ahead.
The turn, yes. Okay, yeah. So the turn. I just wanted to say that the thing that drove me to write the turn. So I told you that I thought with Lincoln Raw that we owed it to him to let him tell his side of the story. The turn, it was almost more emotional for me because I think I said, well, Lincoln was a big boy. He was 52 years old or something when he took office. And I said, but I looked at William Johnson. One of the most consequential people in American history. And there is probably in its entirety one paragraph of historical record.
It's so sad.
And I said, this just isn't fair. So I knew that I had to invent some things because even if he was in the room when Lincoln was having a conversation with a cabinet member, there was no record of it. There would be no record of it. I even did one scene where I have him meeting with a cabinet member, and the meeting is going on, the conversation's going on, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of it, and I wait till the middle of it, the cabinet member looks at, wait a second, does he belong in here? He hadn't even been seen.
Yeah.
Uh, so that was what drove me to write that book. I wanted William Johnson and people like him to be seen because Lincoln was always on guard when he was around people like his cabinet members,
Mm-hmm.
senators, governors. Partly because he knew that these were people of power, and they could determine his what he could get done. But when he wanted to know something, when he wanted to learn something, and that's the better word, he's learned something, he didn't ask them. He would have a conversation with one of his two valets, William Slade and William Johnson. He would have a conversation with his wife's dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley. He would have a conversation with the nurse, Army nurse, Rebecca Pomeroy, who was assigned to care for the Lincoln family. Another person who has been almost criminally ignored by historians. I read. I'm getting this is a passion because I'm writing that book now. But I was reading what one historian had to say about Rebecca Pomeroy, and his comment was that, well, we don't have any corroboration for the account that she's giving of her engagements with Lincoln. And I'm sitting back and I'm saying, wait a second, Lincoln himself said she was the best friend he had ever known. He told a United States senator to go look her up because she was a very fine Massachusetts woman. And he also said to her, he said, when you are an old woman, please tell your grandchildren that the nation owes you a great debt for holding up my hands in time of trouble. And then finally, 9 years after the Civil War, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy goes and visits her and says to her that no one knew his struggles more than you.
Wow.
So I'm sitting here and I'm saying, wait a second, historian, how did you miss that? How did you miss that corroboration? And so that's and it's a rich story.
Oh, I'm excited. I didn't realize you told me before you were writing another book on a female. I didn't realize that's who it was going to be. And I'm totally excited because she's in this story and she
He
enters
is right.
his life in this story. She's kind of like a side feature in this story a little bit. She comes in and out, but not really. She's more towards the end, but I didn't realize she was going to be the one you were writing the next book on. I'm so excited, by the way. Um, and
I go all the way. I go all the way back to when she was 14 years old.
Wow, wow, that is.
So I start when she's 14.
I love that, and I want to talk about William Johnson a little bit too because I love. He's
Okay.
ballet, and I just love his story. And I know some of it is you had to embellish it and you had to make some of it up, but you you do this great job of helping him to grow too. And I love his relationship with Slade, who is an older African American valet that's lighter skinned and so gets permission to be seen in public, where William Johnson can't be because he's even the house servants say he's too dark. And it's a sad story, but I love how William grows too throughout the story. Okay, go ahead. You were going to share something, and I want to hear what you were going to say.
Well, I was just going to say that yes, William was 25 years old when Lincoln met him. The thing that is true in the story is that Lincoln hired him as a handyman or around the office and around the house about a year before he was elected president. That somehow, and of course, I explore a particular theory that is probably about the most reasonable theory out there, about how he winds up becoming Lincoln's valet. It's true that Lincoln never had a valet until William Johnson, and it's also true that William never was a valet until the trip to Washington for the inauguration. And it is true that the White House staff rebelled and said, those domestic staff said, we're not going to work here if you're going to have this dark-skinned man be be the president's valet, because that makes him our boss. Now, remind you, every single person that complained that was dark-skinned,
Yep.
just not as dark-skinned.
Right.
And so those are. But what's interesting is everybody that's in the book, everybody that's in the story, is real.
Okay.
The barber in Springfield
I was
is
just
a
going to
real
ask about
friend
the
of them.
barber. Yep.
Everything I say about that relationship was true. It happened. Lincoln did pay his property taxes for him, because even in Illinois, African Americans couldn't own property. But I think it was four lots that the barber owned in a nearby town. So yeah, I there are some very factual things. The the scene that I won't talk about, won't describe. There's a scene in there that is very, I think, very moving. It actually happened. And then the issue of Lincoln at Gettysburg suffering from smallpox is real. I have a scene in there where Johnson is standing over Lincoln as Lincoln is sitting at the desk in the home that they're staying in Gettysburg, and they are discussing the language of the Gettysburg Address. I made up the romance, by the way, that's in the book. There's a romance in the book. The female character is actually a real person.
Okay.
And the story that I give for her, except for the relationship with Johnson, is real.
Okay.
I try very hard to use real places, people, and things in the stories to make them as authentic as possible. But then I have a rule that I try to follow, and that is that none of those characters, I never allow myself, I try not to allow myself to let those characters do something in the story that I have to make up if it isn't consistent with everything else that's known about that character.
Got it. Yeah.
So
that's interesting, and a difficult task too, because sometimes you'd want it to run one way, and to keep all those different characters straight in your own mind as a writer. And I mean, I love to see your notes on how you did that, and going back through and saying, oh, nope, that could not, she would have never done that, or he would have never done that. And that's a difficult task in and of itself.
that's what Excel spreadsheets are for.
Exactly. They're not just for numbers. They are for ideas and keeping track of that. Absolutely. And I want to dive, there's so many parts of this book that I just love. Lincoln's relationship with his older son comes up in here. And this is I don't want to say it's the first time I've heard that there might have been some embarrassment on Bob Lincoln's part with his dad. But I've heard that speculated before growing up and things like that. And that Mrs. Lincoln, was a little bit embarrassed by her husband too, and some of his bumbling ways. And you definitely bring some of that out. Just tell me about that process of writing that relationship, and what things you found in the actual records that you're going through when you wrote those.
Well, they're in the turn. There is a scene where Bob Lincoln is with a friend of his, a college friend, or actually, I think they're only at the prep school at the time. But they're in the audience when Lincoln is giving a speech in New England, and so there is an actual record of Bob Lincoln's experience there, where he's embarrassed by, the condition of his dad's clothes, by the the story that he's afraid he's going to tell, and those kinds of things, and by his mannerisms and the language that he uses. And he's quite shocked, by the way, when someone who walked through the mud for, I don't know, 4 hours or whatever it was, to hear him speak, on first sight thought it was going to be a real bust. And then when he was done, he was just mesmerized by Lincoln. And then all of Bob's friends run up to the, because this is at the prep school. All of the Bob's friends run up to shake his father's hand and tell him what a wonderful speaker he is, and that kind of a thing, which blew Bob away, because I think Bob was influenced a lot by his mother, and his mother grew up in aristocracy. She was fluent in French, at least, and I don't remember any other languages off the top of my head, but she was a well-educated woman, which was highly unusual for that day. But she was very strong-headed, very strong-willed. She was an ideal match for Lincoln, and so that was kind of their relationship. But the problem to me, the story goes on even farther, and I probably will never write about this, but I always felt that there was something sinister in Bob Lincoln's mind when he got his mother, after his father was assassinated a few years later. He got his mother committed to an asylum. It only lasted for about a year, but it was just long enough for him, according to some historians, to destroy a number of papers and letters.
Oh, interesting.
Which kind of goes along with the idea too that Lincoln's law partner spent 10 years documenting Lincoln's life with people who knew him from childhood all the way to the end. And he had some stories to tell. And some of them, especially one of them, did not go over well with Mrs. Lincoln. And that happened to be the story, and you find it in Lincoln Raw, the story of Lincoln's first love, Anne Rutledge.
Yep.
And she, Mary Lincoln and Bill Herndon, the lawyer, the law partner, went to war over this whole thing. And now we know very little about Anne Rutledge, except for the fact that well, let me put it this way: we have access to information now that we didn't access for almost 100 years after Lincoln's death. And that was the details of the Herndon interviews, where he had information about the relationship. And so there's any guess as to what else that Bob was offended by about his father that he might have eliminated from the historical record, because he was much more involved in the Lincoln tomb, and the huge and beautiful monument that is, and the Lincoln Memorial. And but this was who he always hoped his father could have been, was the man on the man in granite on the throne in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And so a lot of what we've known about Lincoln is colored by the fact that the tradition of Lincoln lore that began soon after his death, we haven't, no matter how hard some people have tried, we just haven't gotten rid of all of it.
Right.
Right. But he was a fascinating man, a deep empath, as you say. He was always wanting to learn, and he had a body sense of humor.
I love how you brought his sense of humor into the book too, and it's just that kind of unexpected, laying on his deathbed with smallpox, and he's cracking a joke with the nurse, right? And just you see that. And I think for me it was kind of interesting because I grew up there were Lincoln impersonators all around me, and sometimes I think of my childlike mind, it's hard to separate the impersonator from the man himself, and just the kindest man. He looked like Abraham Lincoln, the poor guy. He looked just like him, super tall, lanky, dark hair, and they dress him in the hats and stuff. And he would come to the schools and visit and do these things. And so, but he had the same sense of humor and the same kindness and things like that. So, but this was got to be a different side for me. And um, Mary Lincoln's an interesting person. She always sought to live in the White House. She wanted to be in politics. She wanted to
Yes.
be in the aristocracy. And yet she also had a lot of Southern roots, and her brothers and stuff and family were on the South side. And I think one other thing that became very clear as you put me into the position of being Lincoln in the story, um, seeing how Washington and people reacted to them coming. They were kind of like the bumbling backwoods people coming from Illinois and coming into their sacred space and with their ideas, and that this has been her dream. And now she's being lumped in with Lincoln's, unkemptness and things like that. And she's going to be judged by everything that's being done and everything you wear. And she's so worried about all those things. And then, the cabinet is concerned about her background and her upbringing concerning the Civil War and where her loyalties are going to lie and whether she's going to betray, this privacy and stuff. And I just love that position of seeing that, and also realizing, we tend to think about, even as we look back in history, we can take on the modern view of how protected our presidents are, right? They're so
Right.
protected. They have security guards around them all the time. But when they're traveling across from Illinois to New York and stuff, and the dangers and the peril that's lying around every corner. And I guess you just take that for granted when you're reading history, right? That
Yeah.
how dangerous of a time it was and how dangerous it was for her. I mean, you read about accidents she has and whether it was really an accident or not. And
Right.
you just think how easy it was for anybody to get access. I was kind of having panic attacks when they move into the White House and suddenly all these people can just come into their personal space all day
Yeah.
long. And they had to redo some of the way that it was structured. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, it was, and the thing that too about Mary Lincoln is that, I mean, it's not just, to me, it's not just the notion that, oh, she'd always dreamed of being living in the White House. When she was a teenager, I think it was as early as 14. They had a neighbor, less than a mile away in Lexington, who owned a large estate. His name was Henry Clay,
Wow.
a huge name in American history.
Yep.
Okay. And they dined with Henry Clay in their home and in his home. And he was kind of like an uncle to her. And he told her when she was a young teenager that when he got to be president, he was going to invite her to come and stay at the White House.
That's right. Wow.
And so the White House was more than just a dream. It was a reality for her
Mm-hmm.
in terms of it was supposed to happen. It was always supposed to happen, and that's why when she goes into her first day in the White House, when they first go in, and she comes to the Blue Room, she says, "It's mine. It's mine. Finally, it's mine." Uh, that was a 14-year-old girl
Mm-hmm.
who had been denied her whole life until then. That dream.
And that's incredible because I think sometimes history hasn't always been favorable to Mary Lincoln in everything and some of her strong opinions and stuff. And as I was reading the book, I started developing this empathy for her and what that would be like, um, to have this dream, right? And to want
Yeah.
that. How many of us get to live our 14-year-old dreams out in real life, right? Very few of us actually get to do that. And she got that, but yet it was tarnished by this war. It was tarnished by all this political strife. It wasn't just normal political strife. This was seriously, the Union was falling apart. And she had sympathies for both sides, I'm sure, but her strongest opinion was with her husband and doing the right thing. But she had family members. This was very personal to her. And just to
It
have
was,
that.
but
Go
let
ahead.
me interject there for a minute. She when one of her brothers, half brothers, was killed on the battlefield, her reaction was good,
Yep. Yep.
good. I'm glad. He would have killed my husband given the chance.
Yep. She definitely got it, but you can
That
have
was
that
her
sympathy.
attitude towards her family.
I mean, this has been her dream,
Yeah, right,
and then to have that just be so charged, and then to
right. But
get there and live the dream, and then have your son die in that very spot, in this place that
yes,
you've dreamed of being, and to lose your child, and she lost her relationship with her husband in the White House also. She stopped
yes,
being his number
he
one
did. Right.
confidant. And I just think, wow, the cost she paid for this nation too. It's not just Lincoln paid the cost and those his wife, I mean, really paid the price. And sometimes I think history's not doesn't take that into account when we're dealing with her. And I guess I never realized it was her son that had her committed. I knew she got committed. I didn't know until you just said it that it was Bob that did that. Um, and just
And
everything
he
she
was
went
the
through.
only one alive at the time. His older, his other brother was dead.
Yeah,
Yeah, his other brother Tad was dead by then.
got it.
Yeah, by the way, that probably the chief reason that we have this attitude towards Mary Lincoln is Lincoln's secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolai. I call him George in the book because I think that's what Lincoln called him because he had two Johns, you know. But the but it was I mean they were the ones that called her a hellcat and and had all those derogatory things to say about her, and then also Washington society looked down on her,
Yeah.
probably because she was bigger than the rest of them.
Yes. Yes. Being a woman in that day, it was all based on looks and what you had and how you can entertain. And that would have been difficult. And so I just really appreciate though, and the time you took to really put us in the mindset and the way you wrote both these books, um, and how you brought Lincoln alive. You made him in some ways bigger than I remembered him, but also you made him human, because there is so much Lincoln lore, right? And I think you touched on something earlier about him having these personal relationships with his servants in some ways, right? His valet and the nurse and the barber and all these people. But I'm sure to a certain extent that's who he felt most comfortable with, because he was not in that society that was all about dressing up and being something that he wasn't. These people accepted him for who he was, respected him for who he was, and would listen to him even in his rough mannerism, right? His unpolished suits and his nightgown sometimes, right? He has his nightshirt on. He's able to be truly who he is
Right.
around them, and they still respect him for who he was at the same time. And I love that personal connection there, and realizing they're the ones that probably got to see the real Lincoln more than anybody else. And I love that you bring their story to life. And I mean, William Johnson, I grew up in Lincoln, Illinois, and went to Springfield all the time. I'd never heard of him until this moment. And Nurse Pomeroy and all of them. It's timely. It's sad to me to see. William has a favorite quote, and I'm going to try to find it, and maybe you can just recite it, but it's what liberty is and what freedom is. And I'm going to get it
Yes,
backwards. The
it's
equality.
equality is the bedrock of freedom.
That's it. And I love that. And to a certain extent,
Equality. uh,
is still being struggled today. There is still that battle a little bit today, the
yes,
equality in this country. And it's sad, but the book made me sit back and examine too myself in how do I view equality? How do I have any remaining residual thoughts, philosophies that have crept in from anything. And to just think about that concept, even for myself, equality is the foundation. And um, I think sometimes we want to say security is the foundation of it, and it's not always. It is equality. We have to be equal. That's what the whole American Revolution was about, right? Being equal. We wanted equal
Yes,
representation, and then we left out a whole bunch of people in our original founding of our country. And I love that Lincoln wasn't just trying to um, get new policies. He was trying to save this great country that is great. It has its struggles, but America is a wonderful place that people still come to seek freedom. And refugees from all over the world come here. And this book kind of opens that up. How are we going to grow and become even better and take this battle that's been going on for all these years and finally win it, put it to rest? We are all equal, and male, female, no matter what race you are, whatever shade of brown you are, we are all a shade of some color of tan, beige, brown, whatever. And how we're going to put that to rest and just become one and become equal and treat each other equally and have this become who we're even known more for as a country. And speaking of that, you do get into a little bit of Native American in here too. And I never realized that was all going on at the same time too.
yes,
They're all
yeah.
dates on the thing, and all of a sudden when you put it in a story, and that's the great thing about story, rather than doing a non-fiction historical document. When you put things in story, you get that emotion behind it, right? And
Right.
emotional stories stay with us much longer. I'm never going to forget now that the Sioux uprising in Minnesota was at the same time as all the Civil War and all these beginning battles and the time his son was dying, and all these things were happening together. And he had a tremendous amount of things happening during his presidency. And it's personal and national, and really trying to take our nation to that next level and get past these things and do it equally and as fairly as it can without making rebellion happen, right? What a
Right.
delicate balance he was holding. Go ahead, and if you have any thoughts on that and what you learned.
Well, I was going to say that it's interesting too. You bring up the Sioux uprising, um, and I learned this little piece well after I wrote the book. I learned it just actually in the last few weeks. But one of the Sioux who were hanged at
Mhm.
Mankato, and I always like to point out that he was handed 303 death warrants, and only
Oh,
39 were hanged, or 38 were hanged, not 30, but okay. And so that's a side of the coin that we don't look at a lot of times when we deal with this issue. It is true that the Sioux were terribly abused and were probably well within their rights to do everything that they did in terms of an uprising. Lincoln drew the line, however, at violence against women, children, or massacres off the battlefield.
yep.
Those were his standards. Okay. Um, but unfortunately, the record now shows that there was an error, a clerical error.
Oh,
And a young 20-ish Sioux warrior who was actually Caucasian, who had been adopted and raised by the Sioux, was hanged by accident.
oh, wow. Wow. And I think I say that more because knowing Lincoln feels that deeply. Like there was a clerical error on him. And because he took so, doing that was so difficult for him to ever send it. You can see clearly how difficult it was for him to send anybody to the death on either side of the war, either side of any conflict. He didn't want that. Um,
Right.
Wow. And that is a sad travesty and there's lots of those throughout our history. There's sad travesties everywhere, and we're going to find that. And even modern day, we personally don't get everything right. And history's going to tell a clearer story 100 years from now than what we see right now before us, right?
Right. Exactly.
And looking back, it's always easier to see those things, but being in the moment, being in the heat of that moment and trying to deal with things as they're coming, that's much more difficult for any leader. And for us personally, right? To deal with things coming at us and but so much this time period that he was called, he was just, you can see clearly he was the right man for the job at the time because he didn't take it lightly. Someone else could have come in there and just been hard-fisted, hard-nosed and said, done with all of them. We're just going to execute them all. And even on the southern side, he was making decisions trying to preserve as much life as he could and dealing with, okay, if I preserve that life, are they going to go and then murder a bunch of slaves? Are they going, he's always trying to balance all that. What
Yeah.
a difficult position. And
Well, if you take a look at that, go ahead.
oh, we have a slight delay. Go ahead.
If Right, yeah, we have. I'm having a hard time knowing when you're talking and when you're not, because of the way the lagging or something. But anyway, so back for a moment. Uh, you said something about the fact that Lincoln, um, tried so hard, to do the right thing. Um, and one of my favorite things about the Lincoln and Johnson story goes back to really close to the beginning of it, and that is when he gets to when they get to Washington, and Johnson tells him he's learned about this attitude that the other servants have, and Johnson offers to said, just I'll just go home, kind of a thing. I can imagine if you took all of my favorite presidents in history and you interviewed them about this same type of an event, they would say, bus ticket home, train ticket home, hey, sorry it didn't work out, I'm sure that there's jobs elsewhere.
Yeah.
Lincoln didn't do that. He went out of his way while the country was crashing down on him. Let's remember, Lincoln didn't know that Sumter was in jeopardy until the morning after the inauguration, when he had just finished in his inaugural address promising that he would never send troops into the South.
Yep.
But at the same time, he promised he would protect all of the federal property. And that island was federal property. It was built by the federal government. It didn't exist in South Carolina until the federal government brought a bunch of rocks down from New Hampshire and dumped them there. So, but this is the kind of man he was. This is why he took the time that he did to look at all of these different cases, for the Sioux and for the deserters and for even the Confederate soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
And this is why he went through great labors to actually lay the foundation for the Geneva Accords in terms of how we treat combatants in war.
Yes.
That blueprint was created by the Lincoln administration.
Yes, and he laid down a pretty solid law on that, and he was very
he did
profound on it.
Right, yeah, and so that, yeah, and I get back to the fact that all of this stuff crashing down on him at the same time. I mean, and then he takes the time to try to do everything right. I mean, I know what I would do. I would shut off my phone and go sit down my computer and start writing another story.
Well, and just to think about all that and then add his melancholy on top of it.
Yeah.
And add that he needed time and space when those would come on, and how he had to fight past those moments and let them claim him for a moment, and then he had to get back to work. And especially with his son passing, that was probably the hardest moment for him. And he just had to get back to work. And I'm like, I don't even know how he survived because he slept so little.
Yes, right. I was
And
going to mention that, right? 2 to 4 hours a night, if that.
that's crazy. And you just think about that and put that along with his mental health, then that can't be healthy. The people that have depression need sleep, and they talk about sleep being such an important part to counteract that. And then he's not sleeping because he's worrying. He's not just making decisions, walking away and crossing his fingers and hoping it goes well. He is really lamenting and trying to think things through before he makes a decision. It's just fascinating. And again, I go back to that. The way you wrote this book made me experience it with him, made me experience it as if I was him, and how difficult it is. And to take that into modern leaders, I don't care if they're on my political side or not, they all have their weight. They all have the weight of public opinion, everything on them, and just giving them enough grace to say, I don't have to agree with you all the time, but I need to respect that you have a lot on your shoulders at all times. And I think that's a great example. And
You know,
go ahead.
like I say, on a personal note, that what I look for in a leader is someone who walks into a situation knowing that they don't know it all,
Yes.
and they spend and their number one job is to learn as much as they can,
Yes.
and by making mistakes, learn from the mistakes rather than to deny mistakes.
Right.
You know, that's what I look for in a leader.
And I really think as a country, as we look back in history, we have to realize everybody's human, and our leaders can be human and make mistakes and still have achieved great things. And that's it's sad because we wish they could have done things differently. We wish things could have been fixed sooner, and that we could have gotten rid of the slavery issue sooner, and that more people would have done the right thing sooner. But we also have to put everything in context to the time period they were living, and that they were human and they were learning and growing at the same time, and give that grace, a little bit of grace to everybody that had to run this nation. And I mean, Lincoln was only 86. It was 86 years from the founding of this nation. He was president, and that's not a lot of
Right.
time. That's not a long time when you think about it, to have protocol for this. And the nation's falling apart, and Buchanan's like, bye, see ya. It's your mess now. I'm out of here. Glad to leave.
Right. Yeah, let Congress or the courts figure that one out.
Yeah. And he was cleaning up
Yeah.
some mess that Buchanan left behind, and did, with compromising so often and things like that. And so it's just really hard, and it makes you understand we really don't always have all the details, even in the moment. Like when we're reading newspaper articles, that's just what they know right this second. There's so much more behind everything that's going on in this great world. And it's just really an eye opener. And I don't know. I really loved your writing style. I think you hit the nail on the head with Abraham Lincoln. He was a president that I'm very familiar with, have always adored. And to be able to add to his story for me, I think that's a great accomplishment. Um, and to bring him to life, and just to be able to put me into his world in such a personal way, and to put any reader in his world. And I think that it can open our minds to so much more than just even Abraham Lincoln and the time period. But you will, I promise, when you read the book, you will understand history so much better, even though it's not always at the forefront. Like, you're not going through every battle, detail after detail after detail. It's as Lincoln would be seeing it. One other thing that really stood out to me, how slow information was to come to him. I think we take that so for granted. Even when I was growing up, when it was still slower, right? How incredibly slow it was for Lincoln. And sometimes he had to rely on the newspapers to tell him. And how difficult would that be as a leader of this nation? calling up the news. What do you have? I've got nothing. What do you have? I mean, they're not calling up, obviously, but going to and sending a courier to find out what the newspapers have. How would that be to have to make decisions based on that? So,
And then the some of the newspapers he used were Southern newspapers, and they had to sneak those across the battle lines.
and I wondered if they skewed any of that anyway, like how much of it was skewed, how much propaganda was even going on then. And to rely on that as your source, it's just a fascinating time. And your book takes it from that nonfiction dry history to this real life. You're experiencing it as Lincoln would experience it. Everything's coming at you as Lincoln was experiencing it, and in such a profound way. And Lincoln wasn't there in battles experiencing every gory detail. He was getting the reports, and that's exactly who you are when you're as the reader. You're getting the reports Lincoln would get, and you're getting those details. And sometimes he got the gory details, like he would run into the soldiers coming back and get some of that. But you're sharing exactly how Lincoln was receiving it, and you're putting us, the reader, into that mindset of what it was really like to be a leader at that time. And we should all be very grateful for how fast information comes to us now. But I just can't say enough how much I enjoyed the book, and I encourage everybody to go
Thank
read
you.
both of them. You can't, you can read both of them. You can read one without reading the other, but I really think you'll understand the turn more if you've read Lincoln Raw, because Lincoln Raw really gets you into Lincoln's mind and the decisions he made leading up to the election, his marriage, everything about who he was as a child, and just how he became educated, all of it. But you could definitely read them separate and not miss anything. But together, they are such a complete picture, and you will feel that history so much more. It's not dry history. And I feel shame sometimes that our kids just get snippets of history sometimes, and it's dry and it's not so engaging. And so you did a wonderful job of making history so engaging and bringing Abraham Lincoln to life and all those people that were in his life. And I'm so excited, Larry, for your next book. So how close are you?
Thank you.
How close are you on the next book?
I'm okay. I'm at the way I write. You have to understand is when I get to the end, it's pretty well finished. I mean, there is editing that happens, but I don't go back and draft, start all over again. Because I've been doing that polishing as I go along. I know you're not supposed to, but I have to write the way I write. I mean, if people don't like the way I write, well, they're not doing the writing, so it doesn't count. Okay? So my target is 95,000 words. I'm at 72,000 words right now, as we said.
Wow. That's
so
pretty good.
Another way to look at it is that I only have a year of his, or I think maybe a year and a half of his presidency left to cover, and
Okay.
most of the important stuff that I wanted to get across has already happened in the book. So
Got it. Well, I'm really excited, and we'll have to have you back on when you finish that book, because I think hearing and seeing how this woman that's been lost to history is going to be profound, and how history's happening, all these facts and details are happening around their relationship. And that's kind of what you've done in the turn, is it's all happening around these personal relationships. And again, that's why it is as if it is Lincoln. And that is my phone going off saying you are at your hour mark. If you can hear that noise in the background. And unfortunately, I checked it across the room so that if it buzzed, nobody could hear it. But now you're probably hearing my alarm go off. But it was very nice, Larry, to have you on here and to discuss this book, because it was profound and I loved it. And you definitely earned your first place from Pacific Northwest. And I really hope that we're able to help take this to the next level and get this book into more people's hands, because it is an important book to history.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed being with you tonight. So.
Thank you so much. And we will talk to you again soon. You can stay on for a few minutes. I'm going to go ahead and hit stop record.
Great.
Thank you for watching, and don't forget to buy this book and many others at discoverbooks.com, where we let the stories live on and we support self-published authors. Don't forget to like and subscribe.